For years, the ABC has promoted Bruce Pascoe to schools in dozens of ABC videos as not just a historian, but an Aborigine.
My name's Bruce Pascoe, and I'm a Yuin Bunurong and Tasmanian man.
In fact, Aboriginal groups deny Pascoe's claim to be of their tribes, and genealogical records show that Pascoe does not have one single Aboriginal ancestor. Now, the records, of course, may be wrong, but Pascoe refuses to show where. And more important, though, is his fake history. The ABC plans this year to show a two-part series starring Pascoe and claims in his bestseller Dark Emu. Claims to go against all the evidence that Aborigines were not what the histories and even old films show, says Pascoe. They weren't hunter-gatherers, they weren't semi-nomadic. That's all wrong, he says. The Aborigines were, in fact, farmers, and they lived in houses, in towns of more than 1,000 people, with pens for animals, maybe a kangaroo, I don't know. Now, Pascoe claims that he's quoting explorers like Sturt and Mitchell to back up this bizarre theory. But as I've shown you here, and on my blog and in my columns, this is absolutely not true. But for some reason, facts no longer count. Don't count to the ABC. They don't count to the teachers promoting Pascoe and his books. They don't count to Labor and Greens politicians promoting Pascoe. And they don't seem to count to a university which just made him a professor, or to the conferences which hire him as a speaker. Nor do they count to the judges of the New South Wales Premier Literary Award, who gave him a prize. But facts should matter, and to see if Pascoe's facts stack up, I was joined a short while ago by Australia's greatest historian, bar none, Professor Geoffrey Blainey, whose many classic books include Triumph of the Nomads, which is about Aboriginal Australia. Professor Geoffrey Blainey, thank you so much indeed for your time. Can we just start with the most fundamental of Bruce Pascoe's claims? Were Aborigines farmers?
Well, I don't think they were farmers. They weren't agriculturalists. In my view, they were nomadic or semi-nomadic people with a very great knowledge of the environment, but they lived largely by gathering food or by hunting animals. They had, in their heyday, a good standard of living in good years, but they were essentially nomadic, and they were not farmers in the normal definition of the word.
Bruce Pascoe also claims that Aborigines lived in houses in towns of more than 1,000 people. Is that true?
Well, the belief that there were towns with 1,000 people or more comes just from one statement made by the famous explorer Thomas Mitchell, and he said in his journey in southwestern New South Wales and in Victoria that he saw some permanent houses, but he never once used the word 1,000. The word 1,000 seems to have been made up. It's a terrible mistake, and it ruins an important part of his argument. There's no evidence that there are Aboriginal townships with permanent houses dependent for most of their food on agriculture. There's just no evidence for it.
You mentioned Thomas Mitchell. I checked that reference myself. He talks of nothing like 1,000 people, and I think with houses is talking more about huts, some of which get abandoned. Did you come across in any of your writing, you've been writing Australian history for decades and decades, have you ever come across any other explorer that might have described what Pascoe claims, or maybe you haven't picked it up yet? There's an explorer who might have provided Pascoe with these ideas?
Well, in some parts of Australia, there were very small but substantial houses. There were some in southwestern Victoria, in an area where the population of edible eels was very large, and here and there are substantial dwellings, very small, but they're no way typical of Aboriginal Australia. In most parts of Aboriginal Australia, they had very, very lightweight shelters, and there was no point in having permanent housing. If you have to move around for your food, what's the point of having a permanent house when you spend so many nights a long way away from that house?
What do you think is behind this push to now reimagine Aborigines as not nomads and hunter-gatherers, but in fact as settled farmers living in towns, a bit like English yeomen?
I think the first thing that has to be said is that Bruce Pascoe was a good writer, and people enjoy reading him, and that's part of the reason for his success. And I gather that when he speaks in public, I've not heard him, that he's a very lively speaker, so that he's created part of his success. But the reason why his arguments, even though there's so little evidence for them, are accepted is that increasingly there's a belief that Aboriginal society was a utopian society, very close to perfection, that the Aborigines lived in harmony with one another, lived in harmony with nature. Bruce Pascoe even said that they were pioneers of democracy. This is somehow a desire to make the Aboriginal society seem about the most perfect place there ever was, and therefore to say that the Europeans who came and took over the land and created a different way of life were robbers, were destroyers of what was good and replacing it with something that was bad. I think that's the underlying ideology that supports Bruce Pascoe and his work.
So it's a way of, it's the noble savage myth that has been around since Rousseau, and also a way of demonising European civilisation, I guess, or Western civilisation. You mentioned his claim, and it's true, that he says Aborigines invented democracy. Is there evidence for that, that men and women had the vote or decided things equally?
No, there's no evidence that they invented democracy. Until modern times, democracy is a very rare thing in the world's history. The ancient Greeks in some of their cities had democracy, but it wasn't anything like a modern democracy, and of course women were not part of it. And if by chance the Aborigines did set up democracies, women wouldn't have had a strong part in that democracy. I don't know why he puts forward that argument. There's no justification for it as far as I can see.
Geoffrey Blainey, does it disturb you that this clearly fake history, this romantic fictionalisation of our past, has actually been backed as genuine history, not just by some schools and some teacher guides, but by our national broadcaster, the ABC?
Well, in part I can understand the ABC taking up Bruce Pascoe because the archaeologists and the anthropologists in universities have really said very little about him. There's a lot of self-censorship in universities at present, and the universities go to enormous lengths to defend their reputation, and they don't encourage members of their staff to put forward views that are politically incorrect, so that I would blame the universities more than the ABC, but the ABC really should be checking more carefully some of the major arguments he puts forward.
But that's the point, Geoffrey Blainey. The evidence is there. There's a group called darkemuexposed.org that's put it out there since last year. I've written about it since last year. You would think the ABC would stop promoting him. In fact, the very opposite. They've dug in even harder when the facts are so clearly there. Isn't that a bit disturbing?
Yeah, yes, that is surprising. Peter O'Brien has written a book analysing very carefully dark emu and pointing out how many of the statements there have no evidence in their favour. And if they read Peter O'Brien's book, I don't know him, by the way, so I'm not barracking for him in any sense, but you would think that they would read carefully such a powerful critique of Bruce Pascoe's book and ask themselves, should we think twice about this new adventure the ABC are entering.
That book you mentioned can be bought on the website of Quadrant. I think it's called Bitter Harvest from Memory. Geoffrey Blainey, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.